What's up, guys? This is Jimmy with Hifly Fitness, and today we have part two of the Generation eStrong. We're focusing on the intermediate athlete, and we're with Joe Stanek. He is the first intern of the strength athlete under Bryce Lewis, and he has his own YouTube channel called De Novo Training. So the first part is actually linked below on his YouTube channel, and that's all about the programming differences between the novice and the intermediate and how to transition and how we kind of prefer to train the intermediates and the various things we can do. This part of the Generation eStrong, the intermediate series, is going to be all about the differences between what you can do to improve your lifting on different, not just programming in the structural sense, but the specific parts within the programming that we can do to improve your lifting, or let's say if you're a bodybuilder, based on basically your skill level and your goals, what we can do with the specifics of the programming to improve your lifting. And then that's basically it. So we have a lot to talk about. So let's get to it. Okay, so Joe, the lifter is an intermediate athlete. They've probably been training for about 2 years now.
Okay.
They have squatted, benched, and deadlifted like 2 to 3 times a week on each lift. Let's say they're a powerlifter, or maybe they've been doing overhead press about that time too. So their form is kind of on point. You know, they're not doing anything so dumb that's going to get them injured directly. So what do you think they can do to maximize their leverages at that point? Because they have so much skill of each lift under their belt. But, you know, there's always something they can do. So what do you think they can focus on? Let's say for the bench press, what do you think the differences between modifying form as a novice, between modifying form as an intermediate lifter?
Well, I think that obviously if you're a true intermediate, you typically have the form down pretty well. And because of that, you don't necessarily need to work on as you said, don't necessarily need to work on the fundamentals so much. So I think, especially for somebody who's being coached or someone who is the coach, it's a good idea to take a look at yourself overall and really say, okay, how can I maximize my strength on this lift, and try to work around your personal leverages. I know for some people, for example, they on the bench press, let's say, they have longer arms and it's harder for them to bench. So during the intermediate phase, this is definitely that time to work on, okay, how can I maximize my leverage even though I have long arms? What can I do there? So I don't know, you could work on getting a little bit bigger arch in your bench so that you don't have as much of a range of motion. Work on, getting a stronger connection to your legs so you're able to push off the ground with more leg drive. There's a number of things that you can do. And typically when doing something like that, I always like to try to work on only 1 to 2 cues at once, because I find that if you're trying to modify too many things at once, you're just going to screw up your form overall. And as we know, typically everyone says practice makes perfect, but it's not practice that makes perfect. It's perfect practice that makes perfect. So if you're practicing something incorrectly just because you're trying to mess with all these different variables, it's not going to end well. So I typically stick with 1 cue, and we work on those things over time. How about you?
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's really difficult to really just focus on 1 cue as a novice, because there's so many things that we need to fix at the same time. But that being said, we don't want to confuse the novice because they don't know, they're not as aware of their body, and they're not as aware of what cues make sense for them, and you're not aware of what cues make sense for them, as it's always a learning game, and you're just kind of trying to figure out what works between you and them for communication. But it's actually it's kind of more fun for the coach as an intermediate athlete, because you can see one thing that you can just see 1 or 2 things you can work on at a time, because they've already got the fundamentals down. So it's, for the bench press, I think one of the things that there's a bunch of things they can do, but like you said, if you have long arms, you got to just kind of play around with your grip, maybe your grip width, right?
Yeah, there you go. That's another thing.
And then, if that works, widening out your grip or shortening the grip or whatever they happen to have better leverages, or if they have a strong tricep, let's say, a close grip bench might actually work despite their leverages. So there's a lot of things that you got to work with the individual. And that goes for the squat and the deadlift and the overhead press. And depending, like we're focusing kind of on powerlifting, but let's say you're a bodybuilder, if you want to maximize, let's say, the activation of, your rear delt, or I don't know, what's a weakness that you have for bodybuilding?
Let's just stick with the bench press there, for example. Um, so say somebody has I know I personally as a bodybuilder do not have the best chest, again, uh, because of a number of things. But typically, we know from studies and exercise testing and all that, that the decline bench press seems to emphasize the chest fibers a little bit more because they're pointed in the way the fibers connect to the various the way insert into the muscle at various points are at more of a decline angle.
Right.
So because of that, a decline bench press tends to activate more fibers and thus create more growth. So in that case, I would probably say, okay, let's switch over to a decline bench press so that we can work on your chest a little bit more.
Right.
And then uh, maybe I would also throw in an incline variation because typically with a chest, it's harder to develop the upper part of it because you need to be at an angle, and with most people that ends up becoming a lagging body part. So I would throw in a combination of those two things to help improve the size of their chest.
Yeah, good point. And that's another important part is what is your goal, as we talked about in the first part of the series, because everything we're going to be talking about, it depends on the specificity of their training and what their goal overall is. So if they're a bodybuilder, we need to focus on their muscle group, versus if they're a powerlifter, we need to focus on their weaknesses and what's causing them to be weak. Um, like in the bench press, if they have a weak chest, well, that's going to be a weakness forever, basically. But we can do what we can to improve that lagging part of their. It's more of a compounding of the movement. So for powerlifting, it's what's working together to maximize your strength, versus bodybuilding. You can kind of isolate the muscles better, or you can isolate the muscle to improve growth. And versus powerlifting, you kind of have to make sure that you're doing everything together to improve the strength, because isolating a muscle might not actually improve the compound lift in all cases.
Right, exactly. Um, and just because of the difference overall, I mean that's something that's exercise selection becomes very important as a novice as well. Um, I mean overall, you're going to see a little bit of at least typically with bodybuilders versus powerlifters, you're going to see a much larger deviation from compound movements because honestly, the compound movements aren't as necessary. I mean, they're important, of course, to develop an overall physique, but I mean, if your rear delts, for example, are lacking, you're not going to say, okay, well, I'm going to do rows and these are going to hit them. You're going to say, I'm going to do rows, and then on top of that, I'm probably going to throw in some face pulls so that I can grow those rear delts.
Right. And as for powerlifting, since I kind of focus on powerlifting, Joe kind of focuses on bodybuilding, it seems, but also he knows a lot about powerlifting as well.
I consider myself a combo athlete. I'm not a power lifter yet because I haven't actually competed, but I like
Right.
both. I like
And there's
both.
actually things we can learn from, and this is actually a misconception, I think, at the intermediate stage, is that for training for bodybuilding, you have to do, some people think like you have to do just isolation work and you can't do barbell, like compound lifts, because
Right.
at that point you're a bodybuilder, not a powerlifter, so you have to train like in some magical way. But the important part isn't actually the exercises themselves. It is the exercises themselves, but it's not the type of exercises that matters. It's more the weaknesses for the individual. So if you happen to have a weak chest, a small chest as a bodybuilder, that doesn't mean you need to isolate the chest, because you can find a movement like a decline bench, as you mentioned, where you can still maximize the growth of the chest. So, and that doesn't mean you got to stop squatting because you're not a power lifter. You can still use the squat to maximize the growth of the legs, but you can also add a bunch of other accessories like leg curls or leg extensions or variation of the
Yeah.
squat.
And let's think about that from a powerlifting perspective. Say for example, you're having excessive rounding of your back because it's weak. You could actually throw in some higher volume work for your back to help increase the size of it, having a little more muscle to exert more force you'll get a carryover basically. That's what we're trying to say here is that there's a cross between the two. It's not necessarily one or the other.
Right, and there's actually a time and a place to just focus on overall size of your muscles as a powerlifter as well, and that's kind of the one of the staples of block periodization is that there's a certain time where you're entirely focused on work capacity and improving your work capacity. That's going to have an accumulation phase, and then where you convert that overall mass into strength, as it's kind of like a longer peaking phase. Essentially, it's just a big ass peak. That's what block periodization really is. It's you're working up your work capacity, then you're maximizing what you have with that muscle, turning it into strength, and then from just general strength, you're just maximizing your three lifts, your squat, bench, and deadlift. So, block periodization is something that you can really do to, even for powerlifting or for bodybuilding, it might be a good idea to do some block periodization if you want to maximize your overall volume in the long run, is to, focus on the accumulation phase for a lot longer than you would as a powerlifter. And there's various things you can really do even within the specifics of block periodization, let alone all the other variations of periodization that Joe's mentioned in the first video and it's actually his other video on his channel.
Yeah, I mean, typically with block periodization, that's something that I personally, recommend emphasizing a little bit more for the advanced athlete because they need to progress month to month. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't bring blocks in as an intermediate, especially if you're somebody who's a power lifter who needs to actually peak at a certain time. How do I put this? I would say as an intermediate, you don't need to necessarily put as much of an emphasis on the blocks, unless, of course, like I said, you're a power lifter and you need to, peak at a certain point. But it's definitely good to have those kinds of phases. And I mean, like the traditional model of periodization, for example, even though it isn't necessarily ordered into blocks, it has that traditional, or it has that block style format where at the beginning the volume's high and the intensity's low, and then that switches up towards the end.
Okay, so we kind of already know that we can focus. We can change up the exercise selection a little bit to focus on our individual goals, and then we can focus on the various slight form modifications to maximize our leverages for our goals. Okay, so what about the transition to from the intermediate stage to kind of the advanced stage, and how would you go about that with let's say you have a kind of an advanced intermediate athlete?
Okay.
Right up to that point, there's a lot of things you can do for a long time, so we're going to just assume that you've figured out the various things that work for you. Okay, so what happens now when you move from the intermediate stage just to that advanced stage? Not necessarily what happens after that, but how do you kind of transition into the advanced periodization techniques?
Okay. Well, I didn't know we were going to be talking about this, but I unfortunately have not had the pleasure of actually working with somebody who's that close to the advanced stage yet. But what I would typically do, of course, is put a much greater emphasis on their programming, even more to the point where we have literally the entire year planned out, like month by month, week by week, everything. Because in order to make progress at the advanced stage, you need to plan basically, because if you're working your body, your body needs to get worked quite a bit before you're actually able to make a decent amount of progress. So I definitely believe in teaching my clients. So I would obviously talk to them a lot about programming, see how much they know, and sit down with them and talk about what we're going to do that year, what kind of, if they're a power lifter, what kind of meets they want to do, if they're planning on competing, if they're a bodybuilder, if they're planning on competing that year, all that.
And I didn't want to kind of put you on the spot. It's not that we need to necessarily talk about the totality of the advanced athlete, because once you are, an advanced athlete, you better have an understanding of how you prefer to train. All of these things need to kind of be under wraps. You need to know how you can maximize your leverages. You need to kind of know how you can maximize what exercises maximize your results. The programming differences, in my opinion, would just kind of be the planning versus the exercise selection. You kind of already know what things work for you, and now it's all about when to use them, how to use them, at what times to use them, how to peak for a year-long meet, or like a meet that's coming out in a year versus an intermediate. You can kind of do a meet whenever you want and still modify the program, to that meet.
Yeah, that's why I typically enjoy, or not enjoy, but that's why I typically say use a daily undulating model for intermediates. With daily undulating periodization, the premise behind it is a day of strength, a day of hypertrophy, and a day of speed work. That way, you're kind of training all aspects of, like we mentioned, like all the different carryovers are happening at once, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Everything's growing as a kind of a one day something's growing, another day the other part's growing, and you kind of keep building them up together.
Yeah. And then that way, as an intermediate, you could simply just do a slight taper, and you'd be ready to compete at any time. And that is what I like about that. You can basically just, I don't know, say you're a month out from a meet, you could just pick a meet a month out, and you'd be able to get your training to that point where you can just, since you're training all aspects at once, you can just kind of taper and go into the meet, versus when you're an advanced athlete, you actually need to say, okay, I'm probably going to do this meet this far down the road, and actually plan that out.
And actually, we don't really need to talk more about the advanced, because I forgot the peaking phase of the intermediate and the differences between the novice. So I'll just talk about this briefly, but the novices actually they don't really need to plan for the meet. They take like maybe 1 week and they modify it a little bit to give themselves an extra few days of recovery and then super compensate for the meet. Whereas an intermediate, they have to kind of take a month just to, what the whole general strategy is: the 4 weeks out, high intensity, high volume. Third week out, drop the volume a little bit, keep the intensity. Second week out, drop the intensity a little bit. Second week out, or first, 2 weeks out, basically. Drop the volume further, intensity still there. 1 week out, drop both, and then you're going to be able to super compensate for that meet. And depending on how you've been running your program throughout the course of the intermediate phase or for your training cycle, will allow you to maximize for powerlifting your peak. And so, Joe, I actually have a question about this. How would you go about peaking for a bodybuilding show in terms of training? Is there a certain methodology you'd use, or is it not as important as it is for powerlifting?
Actually, it's very important. So there's for a bodybuilding show, typically the peak is a little more focused on nutrition per se, instead of training. But typically what you're doing is there's two different methods that you do depending on the level of leanness that you got to. Well, no, okay, three different methods depending on the level of leanness that you got to, and how you've been training, all that kind of things. But the two most basic ones are a front load and a back load. So front loading basically just means that you are going to add in a lot of carbs over the course of the first part of peak week. And then over time, depending on your reaction to those carbs, you can either taper the carbs down so that you don't end up spilling over, or you can add more. Typically, if you're lean enough, that is the preferred method, because that allows you to see how your body reacts to those carbs. If you're not lean enough, then you have to usually do a back load, which just kind of gives you enough time. Okay, my body is not quite as lean, so I'm going to decrease my carbs over the course of peak week and then hope for a super compensation effect at the end by adding in a ton. And then there's the obvious third option, which is if you're able to get lean enough a couple weeks out, you can actually begin your reverse diet prior to the show. This is the most preferred method, I think, amongst most of the popular coaches like 3DMJ and John Hollywood and things like that. They prefer to actually reverse diet their clients into the show. That way there's no risk of them not being full on stage, and so don't feel like crap. In terms of training, typically what you do is you stop training legs a couple of days out first, because they require a little more time to recover in terms of adding in carbs and things like that, then typically chest and back is stopped training wise next, and then last, like arms and shoulders. You typically only have a single day where you're not training at all before
Okay,
the show.
cool. So, let's look
But that's what a typical peak looks
so
like.
peaking is kind of like the end all be all of why programming is important in my opinion. Um, peaking will allow you to maximize what you've been doing with your programming in general. So if you don't have a competition to train for, then obviously peaking is not that important. But it is a good idea, even if you don't have a competition for strength at least, to just kind of see where you are strength wise, so that if you don't compete, you can kind of start a new training cycle to see where your maxes are, so you're not just kind of guessing how strong you are.
I agree. I agree with that completely. I think it's important, especially for strength athletes, to have like a little bit of a mock meet. If you don't plan on formally competing that year, it's definitely good to peak yourself. That way, you can see where you are and make sure the rest of your training is sound. Um, and I even do this with my bodybuilders a little bit over time as well. After they've been doing, shall we say, hypertrophy focused training, over time, I'll say, okay, you know what? You just took your mandatory deload. Let's test your 1 rep maxes this week. I don't necessarily make them do a mock meet, but maybe on Monday I'll have them come in and test their squat. Wednesday, bench. Friday, deadlift. Just to see where they are, just to make sure they're making
Right.
progress.
So this is going to conclude the part 2 of the intermediate athlete of Generation eStrong. But look forward for more. We're going to probably spend a few more episodes on the intermediate, because there are a few things that I've recently just thought of discussing on another 20-minute episode of Generation eStrong. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys are learning some things from these series. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to my page, check out Joe's channel, check out the previous video. You can find me on Facebook at www.facebook.com/hiflyfitness, or alternatively, just add me on Facebook, Jim Ellie. I don't mind. Um, and on Instagram, it's Hifly Fitness, and YouTube, obviously, is Hifly Fitness.